The oldest work of literature that we know of today is the epic poem of Inanna, the Sumerian goddess. In this story, Inanna has to journey to the underworld to meet her dark sister. When she arrives in the underworld, she is killed and must remain there for half of the year. After which, she is brought back to life and allowed to return to the surface again. This narrative pattern of a descent into the underworld and a rebirth and a return is repeated again and again in ancient myth, illustrating the cyclic nature of the world. As we see it in the changing seasons, with the death of winter and the rebirth of spring, in the waxing and waning of the moon, in our life cycles, in the symbolical deaths and rebirths we go through in our lives as we face sadness and joy, happiness and loss. In these ancient myths, the powers of the underworld are to be embraced, as Inanna embraces her dark sister and returns to her year after year to the underworld for half of the year. But in modern society, we have learned to fear one part of the cycle, that of darkness, death, and decline. Never has death been further away from us than it is today. How many of us wash and dress our dead ourselves? From being a family matter dealt with at home, death has been moved away from us into the hands of professionals, and the dead are treated as something potentially dangerous, stored away in basements of hospitals. But the rejection of the dark parts of the cycle is not just a rejection of physical death, but of everything connected to decay, decline, stillness. We are taught to be in a constant state of growth, constantly doing more, accumulating more, producing more, bettering ourselves, going somewhere. And this goes for our society as a whole as well. But the way of measuring welfare of a society is by measuring its growth, how much consumption and productivity is growing. But eternal growth on a cyclic planet in a cyclic world is an equation that just doesn't add up. The planet has physical boundaries to how much it can give to this ever-growing production, consumption. And these planetary boundaries were actually defined in 2009 by a group of scientists led by Johan Rockström at Stockholm Resilience Centre and Will Steffen at the Australian National University. They defined 9 planetary boundaries, ranging from biodiversity to climate change. And today, 4 of these boundaries are considered to be crossed. And just as the planet has physical boundaries to how much it can give to this growth, so does our bodies, because we too are physical beings. We have boundaries. And still we treat ourselves as if eternal growth was possible for ourselves as well. And we see the result of this in statistics, such as the number 1 reason for sick leave in Sweden today is mental health issues. And out of these cases, almost half are stress related. And I myself am a number in these statistics, and I'm sure a lot of you are too. There was always something I could do more, do better, whether in academics, work life, activism, or even spiritually. And I crashed, like the planet is crashing, into panic attacks, fatigue. And I have found ways to manage these issues in my personal life better, but I still struggle. And this is not an inspirational speech on how I overcame this, because I don't believe that one as an individual can free oneself from the societal context. We are materially dependent on these structures, and we live with a constant inflow of the values of eternal growth. It's not something we can just will ourselves out from. What we need is not so much an individual change as a societal, a paradigm shift. with new political goals and priorities and new ways of measuring welfare aside from economical growth. But what I believe that we can and need to do for a paradigm shift to ever be possible, what we can do as individuals is building resilience. To strengthen our resilience against the values of eternal growth that would have us never rest and always grow. And one way of doing that that I think is really important is by reconnecting ourselves with the cycles of nature, with all parts of the cycle, especially those that we feel alienated from, and in particular the parts that we as a society are rejecting. The dark parts, the parts that holds death, stillness, decline. At the time that I'm doing this talk right now is November, and on the northern hemisphere where I am, this is the perfect time to start doing this, because this time of the year is the time of death. We see it in nature, with the increasing darkness and cold, with the falling leaves and the withering plants. And we see it in a lot of cultural expressions as well, in celebration of the dead and the ancestors, and celebration of death itself, and exploration of fears and darkness. For example, in the tradition of Halloween. And Halloween actually derives from a pre-Christian cyclic culture. It derives from a Celtic tradition called Samhain. And Halloween is sometimes frowned upon partly because of this pagan heritage, but partly because it's not considered a serious holiday. But what Halloween really is a modern expression for our need to create spaces where we can explore death, darkness, and fears ritually. And like Halloween, there are a lot of examples of traditions and expressions in modern society that hold remnants of this ancient cyclic knowledge. But what we're left with is often just fragments of this knowledge. But even where all is lost, nothing is ever really lost. Because the unfragmented knowledge of the cyclic world is out there if we just go out and be with it. Go out in nature and listen to the darkness and learn from the trees, the falling leaves, the withering plants. Or for that sake, go in. Because we too are nature, we too are cyclic beings, and just as we can build cyclic knowledge and resilience, we can do that by befriending our own bodily cycles. And one way that's been really important for me in doing that is through the menstruation cycle. By learning about the hormones that takes part of this process and starting to observe and really be with how that feels in my body. And hold space for and honor the feelings and needs that arise at every part of the cycle, not rejecting any part. Like death, menstruation is something deeply shamed in our society. And one part of the reason for that is, of course, that anything connected to what is coded as a female body is going to be shamed in a patriarchal society. But I also think that another reason for this is that the menstruation cycle is such an obvious mirror of the cyclic nature of the world. And in a society that operates according to a linear, growth-oriented worldview, there are no place for these cycles. At least not the part of the cycles that comes with symbolical death and a need for stillness and introspection. As does often the time before and during bleeding, and as does often the time of menopause, which is another part of menstruation that is also shamed, or perhaps even rather just made invisible. Instead of learning to understand our cycles, we are taught to ignore them and function as if we were linear beings. And I'm not saying here that bodies that are coded as female in any way are more cyclic than others. We are all nature, and thus we are cyclic. It's just that the menstruation is a very obvious mirror for that. So during this time of November, this dark time of the year, I try to reconnect to the cycles of nature by both inside and outside, by really listening into my need for stillness and rest, trying to create space for that. And I try to hold space for that in my life that I need to let go of, like the trees are letting go of their leaves. It's a time of endings, and it's a time of looking to your own life, but also to society, the parts that needs to end and not just grow. And most of all, during this time, I check in with my inner darkness, my own inner underworld, the places of loss, death, hurt, and fear that society many times would have me push away and just ignore and keep working, keep producing. And I'm not saying that we should dwell on only darkness and pain. Of course not. I'm saying that we need a balance. And in a society that values one part of the cycle over the other, we need to pay extra attention to this. But fundamentally, it's not even about that. It's not about embracing any particular part of the cycle, but the very nature of a cyclic world, which is change. Being ready to let go over and over again as the wheel of life turns. And this is where it gets really scary, because change by nature is a form of death. It means letting go of something and moving into the unknown. And of course, we desperately try to cling on to that which feels known and safe to us. And we see it in society, in the strive to maintain status quo and accumulating more of the same. For what would it mean if economical growth no longer ruled society? If we couldn't consume even close to the amount we do today? What if our value wasn't measured by our productivity? What would we fill the void in ourselves with? How would we face the stillness of the dark parts of the cycle? It is scary to walk into the unknown, to, like Inanna, go to those deep places. And I'm sure it was just as scary for people in ancient times as well. So, how do we do it? How do we face change, even though it scares us? Perhaps a part of the answer to that lies in the story of Inanna. For as she entered each gate to the underworld, she was instructed to remove one garment. And as she reached the deepest pits, she had undressed of all her queenly regalia, and she stood before her dark sister, naked. Facing change with courage doesn't mean gearing up and going to war. It's the exact opposite. It means dismantling ourselves of our armors, our privileges, our preconceived ideas, and allowing ourselves to be small, not knowing. The world desperately needs us to do this, I think. Our bodies desperately needs us to do this. To bravely and naked embrace all parts of the cycles of nature and embrace change itself. Thank you.